Hi.
The United States called the Second Great Awakening. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about this reemergence of religious fervor in a post-revolution expanding America. I should also stipulate too, American history is not my forte. I'm not really sure why. It doesn't grab me the same way that other regions of the world's history do, but this is pretty interesting, and it does actually kind of, I hope, paint somewhat of a picture of how the American religious landscape evolved into more or less the landscape of today. Obviously, the landscape of today is still a little bit different and is still changing, but I just kind of hope it helps connect some dots. We'll get started. Immediately after the American Revolution, the United States began to expand their borders further west. They started incorporating much of the land that we now refer to as Kentucky, Tennessee, the Midwest, and the Deep South, and in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, which nearly doubled the size of the country. During that time period, too, American economics and society was changing pretty rapidly. There's a very slow emergence of industry, which wouldn't really take off until the latter half of the 19th century, but industry was kind of very slowly emerging, particularly in the north of the United States. And with all this change, especially after the War of 1812 as well, came a new revitalization of American religious fervor. So the emergence of various new religious movements and various new denominations and theological tenets was a way to promise Americans at this time period a sense of order in a very rapidly changing new country. And inspiring, well, kind of coinciding with new secular concepts of individualism and personal liberty central to the American Revolution, some of these values would permeate into the theological and would spawn the growth of theological tenets that also emphasize the secular components of individualism and personal growth, both spiritual and also economic. So in the first 50 years or so, give or take, of the 19th century, a whole variety of both pre-existing religious movements and new religious movements began to emerge in the United States, mostly in an area of western is anybody here from New York, from upstate New York? No? Okay, I was going to say, most of these originate in upstate New York, in an area known as the Burned-Over District, stretching from Albany to Buffalo. But these religious movements and this new fervor spanned the whole country and would have quite a bit of impact on American history, both religious history and secular history too. So with a name like the Second Great Awakening, you probably might be able to put together that there was a First Great Awakening, and you would be correct. So I'll talk for just a couple seconds about religion in America prior to the Second Great Awakening, but before I do that, I'm going to take a sip of water because my mouth is dry. All right, so at the beginning of the American Revolution, most Americans were Congregationalists, which was a holdover of Puritanism, and I'll talk about that in just a few seconds. Anglicans, who after the American Revolution started calling themselves Episcopalians, and Quakers. There was also a minority of Catholics and a minority of various other religious movements that would eventually evolve into like Methodism and Baptism that were emergent in Europe, mostly in the beginning of the 18th century, but would also cross over into America by the end of the 18th century. Puritans and Quakers were religious movements that originated, well, Puritanism specifically originated in England in the first half of the 17th century, and their followers arrived in America due to religious tensions in England at the time, and established settlements where their followers could freely practice their faith at the time. And today we call those states Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Well, Maine was at the time part of Massachusetts, but New England, the region of New England. And Puritan governance in the 17th century was a religious governance. I hesitate to use the word theocracy because it wasn't like a centralized religious government. Does that kind of make any sense? Like there wasn't a single religious leader or entity that acted as an administrator for everybody. Am I making any sense here at all?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Basically, people were ruled by their congregations in colonial New England. And Puritan clerics acted in a way as civil administrators, and also in a way as tax collectors. At least at first, and then it would later evolve into a colonial magistrate-style government prior to the American Revolution. But there was a First Great Awakening, and I'll talk a little bit more about its tenets in future slides, but the First Great Awakening did take place in the American colonies in the first half of the 18th century, and it created mostly an emphasis on spiritual devotion, individualism, and freedom, which would contribute to the ideas of the American Revolution. The First Great Awakening, I'll talk a little bit more about its theological tenets as well, and it wasn't really all that revolutionary in the sense that the ideas pushed forward by its preachers, namely the likes of Jonathan Edwards, weren't really all that new or profound for the time period. But anyways, the American Revolution itself was largely a secular affair. Its participants had little to no motivation in religion at all. But I'll keep going a little bit more with the First Great Awakening, and I'll compare it a little bit with the Second Great Awakening. So, both of these Great Awakenings were religious movements that spread throughout the American colonies of what would later become the United States, and they provided Americans with a common experience and a common religious vocabulary that united very different regions of the country at a time period when people were far less connected. And both movements also spawned entirely new denominations and also spurred the growth of pre-existing denominations. But the main theology of the First Great Awakening was Calvinist. Does everybody here know what Calvinism is? Someone want to give me a very short description of what Calvinism is?
Predestination.
Yeah, simply put, it's a Protestantism that originated in the 16th century that centers on the idea of predestination. It became very popular in Scotland in the 17th century and then eventually in the Americas in the 18th century. But anyways, I'll continue. The heavy emphasis of the First Great Awakening and the primary concern of its theology was the pre-existing concept of individual sin. Now that concept has existed throughout Christian teaching for centuries, but theologians such as this man, Jonathan Edwards, very famously preached the notion that all people were inherently evil. Delightful. And that, without conversions to the tenets of Calvinist orthodoxy, humans were incapable of making good decisions. And most of the tenets of the First Great Awakening were less about society as a whole and more about the individual. However, the Second Great Awakening, which came a generation or two later, didn't really have any power in upstate New York anymore. We can just pass the mic around to whoever wants to go next.
Anybody?
What was happening to the African Americans in this Great Awakening? Were they religious?
Yes, and interestingly enough, actually, many of these camp meetings, particularly in places like Tennessee, were a mixed race affair. They allowed not only women, but also black people as well to join them, which was a big deal for the time. Particularly, and the main preachers that went to mostly to plantations, but also incorporated mixed race camp meetings were Baptists. And so that's why, to this day, most African Americans that at least identify as religious are some Baptist denomination. Like MLK, for example, was I can't remember what Baptist. But most of them originate, most of their, like black churches, for example, originate in a Baptist tradition that has origins in the first half of the 19th century. Anybody else? We can pass the mic.
Why upstate New York?
People have been trying to answer that question for a very long time. It's a little unclear. Some might argue that at the time period, that was the center of American industry with the emergence of the Erie Canal, and as a result of these new economic changes, that's also where theology evolved. But very few American historians have come to a definitive answer about that for the last maybe 100, 200 years. It's not really clear, but for whatever reason, upstate New York seems to be where most famous American religions originate. Someone want to pass the mic to Don, please?
On a local note, Marcus Whitman came from upstate New York.
I knew that. Yep.
Okay.
Well, if any of you know anything about Marcus Whitman, you'll know that did not really go very well for him. Turns out, people don't really like when you come onto their land and try and talk to them about God.
Give them measles.
Yeah, that too.
He brought measles.
Yeah, that too.
That was the.
Anybody else?
So I think I understand more by osmosis than anything else what this emotional turning to God is all about.
Mm-hmm.
But what was it like before? What was the rational, acceptance of God or turning to God? Like, if you were a Calvinist, did you have to go through catechism classes or something like that? What was?
Not really. I guess before, we're talking about before the Second Great Awakening, right?
Yeah.
Well, before the Second Great Awakening, the core tenet of Calvinist theology was this concept of predestination and this very heavy emphasis on individual sin. And this would have been before this evolution of people's inherent goodness and their inherent free will, which is a pretty big change. But I would say, like, I'm trying to think of how to put this. The rationale was at least promoted by someone like Jonathan Edwards, who I have a slide for right here. In order to, make righteous decisions in your life, you have to come to the way of Christ by means of Orthodox Calvinism.
By means of what?
Orthodox Calvinism, which, to me, purely as a lay person with somewhat limited of an understanding of psychology, sounds a little bit like fear. Sounds a little bit like telling people If you don't do what I say, you're an evil person, and you won't be saved. And I'm not an expert, but the way that I see it is that kind of force of, well, not force, that's not the word I want to use. That force of, you know what, I'm going to just use it. That force of, you need to believe this or you won't attain salvation, was the dominant motivating factor in, salvation.
So control and patrimony, in other words, I mean, this it feels like this mirrors the beginnings of Christianity.
In some ways it does.
Yeah, I mean, this emotional, spontaneous embrace of God, that's what Paul did, right?
Certainly.
He fell off his horse and had a revelation.
Yeah, and that's another thing also that,
And they got rid of the rabbis, not the rabbis, the priests.
right, well, that's another thing too that also comes.
Everything by their laws, yeah.
Right. I mean, I tend to agree with you there. And it's another thing also that comes from this theological kind of revival that's very common, especially in the Latter-day Saint movement, is this concept of personal revelation, that everybody can have or can receive revelations. Which, okay.
Seems like during that period with Christian Science, we talking about Christian Scientist era, or is it before that era?
This is a little bit before that era.
Okay.
But
And LDS.
yeah, so the Latter-day Saint movement does originate in this time period.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't here for the whole thing.
No, I should.
It seems like with at least those two religions, pedantries were involved in Revelation.
I never even thought about that. And I read a book about.
What they had in common were Mary Baker Eddy had a fall and a concussion, and that's where her vision began.
Same goes with Jemima Wilkinson as well.
And there were several during that period that were involved with head injuries that started a religion.
Yeah, but what does that tell you?
I don't know. I have no idea.
I guess not. What that makes me think of is, what does that tell you about what people knew about concussions back then?
Yeah, nothing, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Well, with original sin, could you stack up a whole bunch of naughtiness and then get religion and all was fine?
You tell me. I mean, I don't know. I'm tempted to say no, but of course, I'm not much of an authority there. I'm just someone who appreciates the history and doesn't really have any subscription to any of these tenets at all. But there are people out there who could probably answer for you. Anybody else? This is your last chance. And there it went. Thanks, everybody. And see you all around.